So my name is Paul Bardwil. I've been designing academic programs in Latin America for almost 20 years now. It's hard to believe that it's been that long, but I started when I was 5 years old, so had that much going for me. I started doing the programs to Cuba in 1998, and Sacramento State University, which was one of my clients, wanted to go, so I went down. I was living in Mexico at the time, and I was working with a tour operator from Mexico. He is still, I think, the largest tour operator from Mexico to Cuba. And Mexico has always had an interesting relationship with Cuba. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but Fidel, when he met Che way back in 1950s, they met in Mexico, and they were plotting from Mexico. In the original first unsuccessful revolution that they launched, they were caught in a boat that left from Mexico to Cuba. And there's places in Mexico City, famous cafes and everything, where people go and find where they were actually meeting and planning to come to Cuba. They were caught and jailed, and somehow they miraculously escaped, but a lot of the people from that boat did not. They were either died in jail or before the scuffle actually occurred. So there's a long history between Mexico and Cuba. And even in the 60s, Guadalajara was kind of a hiding place for Fidel when the CIA was trying to hunt him down and kill him. And so Mexico City and Guadalajara have a deep tradition with Cuba, and so Mexico has been working, in tourism and assistance with Cuba for many, many years. So that's how it all kind of started for me. It was in Mexico working with this operator. I call him the padrino, kind of like my godfather, who kind of took me under his wing and taught me everything from how to smoke a Cuban cigar to where the most beautiful women in Cuba are, which is Cienfuegos. Of course, everybody has their own preference, right? But I went to school at SMU in Dallas, a pretty conservative school. You wouldn't think of a guy that coming from SMU would be going to Cuba, but here I am. I was a realtor, I've been an attorney. I've done special projects with an international corporation, and that's what brought me to Cuernavaca, was to create a Mexican corporation there. And then, like I mentioned, we started the first programs with Sac State, and we're working with Vinales Tours. So things about Cuba that are different from other countries are that, Cuba actually is a very safe country. Everyone has this fear of like, oh my God, we're going to the red machine, are we going to get out, or is Fidel going to let us out? But if you were to dial up the statistics, it's probably like the safest destination in the world, certainly in Latin America, for going. And because of the fact that it is kind of a controlled society, much to the chagrin of Cubans to a degree, but as a foreigner coming in, it's a very safe place. And this woman right here is a woman who's, I don't know if you can see the Fat Boy cigar she's got in her mouth or not, but she's, we turn the lights down just a touch more, we can see that. Or can you see it from there? Anyway, look, you can't really see it. And she's just posing, to take some pictures. But, in Cuba, you can buy cigars at the state-run stores, and those are anywhere from $100 to $250 a box. But you have a lot of people in the streets running around selling them, for much cheaper. And the guys will always tell you, oh, don't buy those, they're fake. Like, well, wait a minute, we're in Cuba, they're a cigar. How can they be a fake Cuban cigar, right? Now, obviously, if they're filled with pencil shavings or something like that. But, to me, I always encourage people to go off and do a Cuban cigar purchase and see what it's like, because you'll navigate through the streets and you'll see somebody on the corner like, hey, puro, cubanos. So cubanos, they'll say cubanos, which is short for Cubans, which is short for Cuban cigars. So you want a Cuban cigar, and if you say, yeah, and so then he's taking you through the streets and navigating through all these little dark hallways, and he takes you into his house, and then he's got him hidden, up in the roof, and reaches up and gets them and pulls out these, a lot of times dried out cigars, but every once in a while, there's some good quality cigars, and we'll want 25 bucks a box versus 250. So you do the math, it's not a bad deal, and there's ways to bring them back to life a little bit and smoke a Cuban cigar. Plus you've gotten to go inside a Cuban's house, which is kind of cool to see what it's all about. This is one of the things you can do, and I just would not encourage that in Mexico City, nor Guadalajara, nor Rio, nor Monterrey. But it's a place where you can do it in Cuba, and it's okay, as long as you have a buddy.
Would that lead you to be a visitor of a Cuban jail too? It's
a good question. The interesting thing is that as a foreigner, you have much more rights than the Cubans. So if the Cuban's busted selling you cigars, he's going to jail. Mm-hmm. But I've actually stood out on the street with 4 boxes of Cuban cigars in a bag, and the police officer questioning the Cuban, but would not look in my bag. Right. would not let him up. Thank God he did. But I guess theoretically I could have been thrown in jail, but they don't want those stories getting out that would ruin tourism. So they may take him away or tell me not to do that or slap me on the hand, but they would throw him in jail pretty quick. And the interesting thing is when you're walking on the streets in Cuba, you have to have your credential. Like in the States, if we're just out to go grab, let's say we go to the corner market just to get some ice or bologna sandwich or whatever, we don't need to have an ID. But if you're in Cuba and you are out on the street at all and you don't have your, they call them carne for short. Carne is like meat, but it's short for credential. If you don't have your credential, they can throw you in jail. And a lot of times they want to check that because if you're coming from another province, they're thinking, oh, you're just here to hustle in Havana. So you're coming from Cienfuegos, or you're coming from Trinidad, or you're coming from Santiago, and you're in Havana. I want to know who you are, and I've seen you the first time, and I might let you go, and the second time possibly, but the third time, if I think you're prostituting or selling, I'm going to throw you in jail. Okay, so that's kind of the way it goes with the Cubans. So, good question. So why Cuba? Why do people want to go to Cuba? I'll ask you guys, what's your interest in Cuba?
It's been off limits, maybe.
Off limits?
You want to check it out.
History?
History, arts, shoes.
Shoes. Guadalajara is better for the shoes than Havana, but they have some shoes there too.
Cultural connection to see the parallel between Cuba and Puerto Rico and my country.
Okay.
And what is that place with the, it's the wall with the waves and you see it?
Havana. It's called the Malecon or the boardwalk. You want to see the Malecon, yeah. And it's long. It's probably like 11 miles from one end to the other. So it's an island, and that's kind of protection to build, like combination to protect the city, to protect erosion, roadway, and the Malecon. And it's a pretty long province. Okay. So a lot of you guys, want to see it maybe before it changes, see what's going on, maybe form your own opinion. And see that it's thriving. And like I was saying, I'm going to throw in a few statistics because there's things that I'm learning all the time that I don't have time to go in here and update this stuff. But for example, just 2 years ago in Cuba, they made it legal for you to sell a car. So prior to that, it was very hard to sell a car. You had to kind of quietly trade it or barter it or underground get rid of it. The old cars that everyone wants, the American cars, the reason why they're so popular and the reason why they exist is prior to 1961, before the revolution, Fidel said, if you own a car and it's yours, and you can sell it to your kids and you can pass it down. But after 61, you couldn't own anything. So these people have these cars. It's like an inheritable right, like a piece of real estate. And so you lift up the hood of a 50 Ford, and it's probably got a Russian diesel engine in it, or Mazda brake pads. And Cubans are very inventive. So there's a little saying, okay, no tengo lo inventa. What we don't have, we invent, we make it up. And they have to because they don't have resources, and they certainly don't have dealers with American car parts companies that can actually get them down there. So you'll see on the plates it says particular, which means it's owned by a person. They own that particularly. Again, the thinker. Why Cuba? So you can form your own opinions. I mean, none of us, we're free will Americans. We don't want to be told that we can't travel anywhere, right? We want to go and form our own opinion. The interesting thing about Cuba is it's not really illegal to travel there. It's illegal to spend money there. So the Treasury Department regulates the travel to Cuba, and it's done through OFAC, which is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And then that office regulates the trade, for trade and travel to Cuba. So it's illegal to actually go there. But this is why, again, some people would like to go just because they like to be able to form their own opinion of Cuba. Have that freedom to travel, which is one of our amendment rights, right? Before I get into the history, I'll tell you a couple of other things too about current affairs with Cuba. One, 2 years ago, that they allowed you to sell cars. Just last year, they made the same thing with real estate. If you own it and you can sell it to a Cuban. So prior to that, what you have is like a grandma who had this house of 5 bedrooms that everyone now was dead or gone, and then she would find somebody that was a young couple with 2 kids. And they trade. It's like, okay, here's our condo and our flat, we'll give you the house and $100,000 or whatever it is. So that's how it used to work in Cuba, but now it's actually legal to transfer title to another Cuban. So that's occurred. The third thing, which just occurred about 4 months ago, is now Cubans can get a visa and they can get a passport. Well, they can get a passport, which means they can leave the country, and then they have to get a visa from the other country that they're visiting, okay? So prior to that, it was like really hard for a Cuban to leave the island. But now if you have $100, which is a barrier, because not everyone has $100, you can get a passport. And if you have an airline ticket, you can get an airline ticket. there's a big contingency of Cubans that live in Miami. So my first question to you guys is, how many people would guess what the population is of Cuba?
Million.
Anybody else? Of the whole country. So it's about 11 million people. 11 million in Cuba. In Miami, there are 1 million Cuban Americans living there. They're born in Cuba, living in the United States. Okay, and then of course there's Cubans living in Spain and Latin America, but in Miami, which is the heart, the heart of the Cuban community, 1 million people. So a lot of strength in Florida, and these are not like the poor people, right? So when you think of immigration and you think of people coming from Mexico or Guatemala or wherever to the United States, it's usually people looking for opportunity. But in this case, these were the people in 1959, 60, 61 that have money, and they were flying in and they were moving their businesses here and establishing it, right? So different culture, and people don't realize, but like if you touch soil even today as a Cuban on the ground, within a year you could be a citizen. And a Mexican, it could take 15 years to never. There's wait lists that are huge, right? So you can claim political asylum, step on the ground. I had a friend who was a guide. He got in here within a year as an American. So before he even became a citizen, he had a scholarship. And I mean, it was amazing. So the Cubans have it wired in Florida. You can pretend like you're Cuban, probably get some scholarships there.
Is the U.S. going to give visas?
For
Cubans with a passport?
that's always the question, but it's much easier for a Cuban to get in than it is. If say, for example, if you have a dance group, like we were just saying, a dance group to come in, the United States government prior to Obama was very stingy with giving anything. And with Obama currently, they're much easier. The way it goes is the Democrats are freer and easier with Cuba and the Republicans aren't. And a lot of that has to do with Miami, because those Cubans that are in Miami that have political clout are Republicans, and they have money. And so they're the ones that are controlling the politics of Cuba. It's not the United States government.
We don't have an embassy in Cuba, do
We have an interest section in Cuba. And it's, and the interest section is not really something that serves our people. It's a CIA facility. So if we have an issue, like you lose your passport or something, we go to the Swiss embassy. And there is a Cuban interest section, or there was a Cuban interest section until a few months ago. So you may have seen in the news, like, Cuban interest section, not issuing visas, what's going on. And they're still issuing them through Florida. There's a consulate there. But it's kind of quirky because the news makes it look like you can't go into Cuba, but Cuba travel's not stopped, since all this has been going on. I know people that are going there daily through Florida, and it's like, really? It's closed? Yeah, but not really. But okay, so if it's not closed, then what's up? Well, this facility in Florida. Well, does anybody know about it? Well, not really. What is it? Well, it's a Cuban consulate. It's not really, okay, it is. So it's kind of quirky, but people are still going every day. I have a friend named Addie who helps me with all my passports, and she helps me with all the visas. And I don't know if you guys have ever had a foreign friend like this, And Addie's standard response to everything is, don't worry about it, don't worry about it, But Addie, I just read this article. Drew just sent me this article. Man, what's going on, man? The consulate's closed in America. No, don't worry about it. I just had a group today. Don't worry about it. I go, so Addie, so let's say the chancellor wants a letter from, somebody in power stating that, that this isn't, that there's not a problem with the visas. What do we do? Well, tell them I'm in with the consulate. I go, oh, you work for the consulate? No, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So it's kind of like, so I just told Drew, don't worry about it, Drew, don't worry about it. Just pass it on. But that's the reality. It's like, really, how's this occurring? It just is. It just is, and there's not really lots of explanation for it. But visas are still being issued. And I've had groups even last year, San Francisco City College went in, the visa was handed to them when they got into Cuba. They didn't even have a visa on the plane, but once they got into Cuba, they handed it to them. So they're, no tengo lo invento, what they don't have, they make it up. It's just the way it is. And you just have to kind of go with that, or you just, get a lot of gray hairs, which has some, but not that many. But you learn just to kind of live with it. So anyway, the history of Cuba, Bay of Pigs, occurred, what happened was in the 60s, 1959, 60, 61, this area after the revolution, the Cubans were upset. Their assets as well as the United States assets were frozen, taken, and so a group of Cuban Americans that had left from Cuba, living in the United States, were trained by the CIA. They went into the United States. They invaded the United States, and it was a horrible disaster. And so most of them were killed or jailed or whatever. And so that was a big black eye on the U.S. politics, right? I mean, how can this one little bitty country like this make us look so bad? And so basically, Fidel knew there was going to be retaliation. It's like, it's just a matter of time. I mean, what's going to happen? And he knew that we had the nuclear capability to do whatever we wanted to do with them. So what does he do? He goes to Khrushchev and starts talking to the Russians, and basically says, hey, we got problems here. I mean, they had a false invasion. We know it's just a matter of time. They knew he needed to get something to take care of it, so the Russians put missiles, land-based missiles, in Cuba, and that was the beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this was during the Kennedy administration. So there was a negotiation between Khrushchev and Kennedy, and Castro was in the middle, and basically, we decided to move our missiles off of Turkey, which were, on the border of Russia, and then the agreement was the Russians moved their missiles out of Cuba, hence avoiding a nuclear war, which actually went to DEFCON 2, and it's the closest we've ever been to a nuclear war. Very, very close. So got away from it, but then there's all these rumors. I'm sure you've seen the Kennedy movies. Who killed Kennedy? Was it Castro or not? Or we tried to kill him. He was successful with Kennedy. Who knows what the truth of the matter is? But Fidel's still alive, and unfortunately Kennedy isn't. So why Cuba again? Colonization after that agreement, and this goes back into history even further, which is kind of like, for me, it's always interesting to kind of say, how is it that Cuba escaped? I mean, what the hell? What's going on over there that makes them so different and unique? So, they're about ready to being taken over by the United States, and they avoid that. And even if you go back in history with Spain, they were a Spanish colony during the whole Batista time. And when this was even before this was like in the beginning of the 1900s, it was a battleship Maine that went down, was cruising the Bay of America and the United States. And there was all these newspaper articles that were being written by Hearst and other newspapers saying, there's going to be a war, and we need to get in there, and we need to take care and straighten out Cuba. So we go down there, and we have the battleship Maine sitting in the port, and it blows up. The battleship just blows up. I mean, can you imagine today if one of our battleships just blew up? We'd just be probably invading that country. And they were like, well, what happened? And no one really knew. Was it the Spanish? Was it the Cubans? And some people just said the ship just blew up because it had a bad smokestack. But the end result was that we kind of pointed at Spain, because Spain was there and it was really Spain's territory. And we went down there and rushed down there and got in a war that lasted probably 24 hours, and Spain, surrendered. And as a result, we got the Philippines and Guam and access to some other countries. And Spain basically said, okay, but we want Cuba to still be Cuba. We kind of want it to be our territory, but we want it to be kind of self-ruling. So the Platt Amendment came in and basically said, okay, Cuba is Cuba. It's kind of run by Spain, but then it's kind of got its own autonomy too, which eventually led to the revolution where Fidel took over. So it's pretty amazing when you think about it historically. How is it that Cuba escaped this whole thing with Spain, this whole thing with the United States, and then they still maintain their autonomy, and then they bring Russia in? It's like, it's almost like one of those Bermuda Triangle things. It's like, that's pretty interesting how they can survive all of that stuff. So little history about Cuba. But again, why Cuba? The people, simplicity, and since the revolution, there were, some of you may have read, educators may have read about how they had a literacy campaign. They went all across the country in 61 and 62, and a country that was maybe 70% literate, they made it high 90% literate. And they were called the brigades, the brigadas, the literacy brigades. So from an educational standpoint, from a healthcare standpoint, Fidel's been very big about, having doctors in every neighborhood has a family doctor, where the doctor lives upstairs and practices medicine downstairs. These guys unfortunately don't make much money, $20 a month. Like everyone in Cuba makes about $20 a month. But they love what they do, they're passionate about it. So the education is free, the medical's free, the housing is free to a degree. There's still rations, which you can't really live on, but to a degree you get that too. But the problem is just their economy just hasn't matured to deal with this. So they're poised to be almost like an Ireland was in the 80s and 90s when all the high-tech companies went there, because they've got these educational institutions all set up. They've got educated people, but they don't really have jobs for them. And another reform that was made 2 years ago is that the government cut about 500,000 people from the payrolls of Cuba, of the government sector, and they created a list of 160 activities that Cubans can do as entrepreneurs. So a Cuban can have a hotel in his house, like a bed and breakfast. A Cuban can have a restaurant in his house called a paladar. And now, from cutting dogs' hairs to shaving, metal that's corroded from a refrigerator and patching it with new metal, to cutting hair, to shoe repair, there's 160 activities that Cuba's outlined and said that we can now do legally in Cuba for entrepreneurs. So they're trying to build money for the country for within, as well as there are the Cubans that are living abroad that send money in, and that's created a class system in Cuba, because if you have family that lives outside of Cuba, then you get money in, and then you're living a lot better than someone who's just living off of rations. 1 out of 3 Cubans have a relative in the United States. Entertainment, you guys have obviously probably heard of it, seen the Buena Vista Social Club and its band members. It's a little bit like the Grateful Dead. Those guys were in their 90s 10 years ago. So the real ones aren't around anymore, but the kids are alive, or the uncles or whatever. But the music is important and popular. Dance is important and popular. Hence this program we're doing dance, both salsa, Afro-Cuban, and then there's ballet too, which the ballet in Cuba was actually created originally by Alicia Alonso. She danced in the National Ballet Cuba. And she also danced in the New York City Ballet. And she went to Cuba and created that. And still to this day, she's 94 years old. She's the principal partner of the Cuban Ballet, or the National Ballet Cuba. So a little bit about the medical system. There's lowest infant mortality in Latin America. They actually have a slightly lower infant mortality than we do. The life expectancy in Cuba is actually slightly higher than us too. And so their medical system is working. A lot of it is based on just preventative medicine, the kinds of things that they do, in the neighborhoods, as well as the doctors live upstairs and downstairs. They practice on days off. They organize Tai Chi for older people. They have campaigns on immunizations, and they make sure that everybody's taken care of. One thing that makes Cuba, I always say it's an enigma wrapped in a conundrum because of just the complexities of it all. They have these drugs like this Nimbutuzum, which actually is used for tumors in head and neck, and it's not as aggressive in terms of hurting you like some of our things that we use for cancer. And they also have things in diabetes as well that they've discovered. They've got treatment for Parkinson's. They use embryonic tissues in transplanting. And PPG is actually a natural medicine that is used to reduce cholesterol, and it's all natural, made from sugar cane. And they didn't realize it in the beginning, but it also acts kind of like a natural Viagra too. So anything that increases circulation works in other places as well. And medicine in general, within the neighborhoods you have pharmacies that are traditional as well as green pharmacies, so natural medicine. And a lot of times it's good for preventative or actually cures things rather than just kind of dealing with symptoms. And the educational system, like we mentioned before, in '62, claimed the year of education, and that's when they started the brigades. So there's a lot of statistics on the number of people in classrooms. The classrooms from 1958 to 1968 doubled from 7,000 to 14,000. Teachers tripled from 21,000 to 68,000. They created special schools for the deaf. They created special schools for blind, for mute, and then also they did special schools for music, for visual arts. And so all of these were created in the 60s. Again, your literacy was claimed, as we mentioned before. School for everybody is free. Uniforms were implemented, and basically different colors for different grades. School is considered compulsory until the age of 15. And there's also the special schools that we mentioned for the arts. And the way they do those things too with the arts is just it's interesting, because they'll create a school like in Havana. They can't do it across the country, but they try to find the students from all the provinces. But all the provinces have universities, so everyone has access to a university if you live in that province. However, if you're in design, or if you're in computer design, or if you're in the arts, if you're in special fields like that, then there's usually like one school in Cuba, in Havana, and maybe one school in Santiago. And then they build dormitories for those people. Once they go and they provide those, then they send them back to the provinces so that those people are taught. So there's this element of taking the resources that we have, allocating them, putting them back into the communities so that they're reused, and so people from everywhere else also has access as well, which is good, and it's what a lot of our educators do. They go to Cuba and just see these simple strategies of, okay, we give you a scholarship, then you have to fulfill your promise and actually go back to the community. There's a medical school, and we were talking earlier, there's a medical school in Cuba that gives 500 scholarships to Americans a year. So the only requirement is that when you finish, you're supposed to come back and work low income while you're here and kind of repay and help out your own culture. And I don't know if you guys remember, but during Katrina, the storm, Fidel offered to send doctors to the area because what do you got in a hurricane? You got a mess. You don't have any electricity, you don't have any gas, you don't have access to computers. So these doctors in Cuba that deal with hurricanes every year, right? Almost every hurricane that goes through Miami has gone through Cuba. And he offered teams of doctors to come and help in Katrina, but Bush did not accept that. So. But Bush did build a presidential library at my campus, so I can't be a total Bush hater, right? And he goes to our basketball games too. So there's good and bad in everything, all right? Got to see the other side. Legally travel to Cuba is basically, this is a general license. So now for big categories, if you are going for education, like if it's a course that's offered in the United States, then you can offer that course in Cuba. Do we have any professors here? Anybody that wants to be a professor? Anybody that can get a certificate to him? Oh, professor.
I could be professor.
Okay. So anyway, if you have an idea for a course and you want to teach it, as long as it's here, if it's Cuban art, if it's Spanish 1, if it's mathematics 2,
Cuban literature.
for ESL, for credit,
Yeah, it could be.
then yeah, you could. Then you take that class and then you offer it in Cuban. As long as you do that, that's considered quality. You can do that, qualify for a general license. And Obama rules that changed in 2011. He stated that as long as you are doing a class that's offered, in a university or college currently, you can offer it in Cuba for credit, and that's a general license. If you have a church and you're doing religious activities, and those activities are defined by OFAC as permissible, which is kind of touching on mission work, more or less like if you're helping the Cuban people. Well, it's kind of good when I'm speaking to them. You guys hear me better now? Makes me want to sing. Anyway, when you have something that is related to church that is religious purposes that is defined, and the OFAC has, which is Office of Foreign Assets Control, they're the ones that look at all these licenses. So they have a list of do's and don'ts. If you're doing a church tour, you just want to see church and you want to compare the singing and the choirs, that would not be classified as a religious activity. If you're going to help them build a church or repair a church, that would be considered an activity that could work. If you're going to work with a orphanage that has activities in it, that might be deemed as allowable. But you can't just go and make it look like a disguise of tourism. Anything that looks and smells or tastes like tourism, then they're going to deny. If it's something that you're doing to benefit the Cuban people, or something that's considered, like I said, more like mission work, then it could qualify. So, any church people that want to talk to me later about that, feel free to. I've done both. I've done general licenses for religious purposes as well as for universities and colleges.
How about religion in Cuba? Mostly Catholic?
Mostly Santeria. That is actually practiced.
Whoa.
You could say that there's more Catholic churches, but the actual practice of a religion is probably more Santeria. But the interesting thing about Santeria is you're supposed to be a Catholic before before you're a santo. So it's kind of like you got to be a Catholic before you get there, kind of thing. So interesting kind of nut about that. I'm not a specialist on it, but it's interesting because there are a lot of similarities between the gods and the saints and the different aspects of it. There's some overlapping, but yeah, that's what's actually practiced. I'd say Santeria first, Catholic second. So going to Cuba currently, legally from the United States, you need a license, and we talked about the two most common. There are others. You can basically, if you're a photojournalist and journalist and you're writing papers and you've got a newspaper that's going to say, yeah, he does all this stuff on letterhead, then you can go as a photojournalist as well. And there's different humanitarian reasons, but I'm kind of just focusing on the two major ones, okay? If any of you ever had a question later on, send me an email and said, hey, I'm interested in going, could I do this? Then there's a possibility. There's a general catch-all phrase that if it sounds or smells or seems like some of these other exceptions, but it's in your field, you can write and request and they may grant it in a specific license, okay? But those are general, the ones I mentioned are general. You don't actually need something written from the government saying you're going. You can just go. Otherwise, they're specific, and that means you specifically get a number and a letter from the government saying, okay, I've got this incredible humanitarian company that's figuring out a way to lower the pollutants so that we lower the greenhouse effect, and we're going to integrate it into Cuba. Can we go? If the government says yes, then they'll stamp it and say why. So currently, the most common and really at this point the only realistic way to go from the United States is Miami. There were destinations that were given the opportunities to fly: LA, Atlanta, New York, Tampa, and Houston, but they've all failed. LA has a flight occasionally. I would never trust it because you never know if it's actually going to go or not. It's a charter. So I'm not going to bring 50 people down to the charter company LA, fly all the way to get to LA, and have them tell me, oh, we didn't have enough people to fly the plane that day. But Miami, every day there's charters, and there's more than one. So if there's an issue with getting out, you can get out that afternoon or the next day, and that makes it feasible. Why is that? Because there's a million Cubans that are going back and forth. I mean, so that's number one. You have to have, a number of people in a city and a base of any kind of, before you can add American group travel. American group travel adds travel to Cuba, but it's not enough to rely on it. So there has to be an economic base for an airline to be able to run, and they can run it off the Cubans that are going back and forth. Cubans can actually travel freely to Cuba. They don't need permits or license. So if you're born in Cuba, you can go back and forth. So it kind of gets back to the idea, the quirkiness of who's really running the policy of Cuba. The Cubans, right? How is it that they come here, become citizens, and they can travel freely to Cuba? That doesn't really seem fair, does it? That's why I go when I want. You can also pick other countries to go through, third-party countries, and up until 2004, a lot of people went through Mexico or the Bahamas or Costa Rica or wherever. But Bush was actually finding people to do that. Now you can go because it's not really heavily enforced, but if they catch you, it's a $7,000 fine. So me as a person, would I do it? Maybe. Would I take a group down that way? No, I couldn't do that. Where do people stay? Because sometimes, study abroad offices want to do family stays, and currently they're still not really family stays. There's some pensions or large houses that are used for some of the academic institutions. Music institutes have dorms, like we talked about, for Cubans, and sometimes they'll make those accessible to Americans if they fulfill certain requirements. And again, these are some of the dorms I mentioned: the schools of design, lower hotels, historic hotels as well. But the historic hotels get kind of expensive. And again, programs, I've done a program in Davis that did last 11 weeks. They stayed in kind of like one of those houses for academics, but those are very hard to find, and also you have to kind of go through the Cuban red tape of getting in. The most common ways of doing it is to do like a 2-star hotel, 3-star, or 4-star hotel to Cuba. And those are the most common ways. And these are just some little things you may not have known about Cuba. Up on the top there's a guy doing Snoopy on the walls of Havana in the neighborhood. So he actually works for Jeannie Schultz, who's Charles Schultz's widow. And I helped her get this artist in and actually do Snoopy on the wall of Havana. There he is, the artist, and his message for our friends in Muraliando, which is the neighborhood that does this kind of work. And to the people of Havana, a message of love and hope and happiness. And it's from Snoopy in Woodstock. Many thanks. And this is actually inside the... this is actually inside... Am I supposed to get closer? This is actually inside the...
No, you're fine, Paul.
Okay.
You're good.
This is actually inside the Museum of History. And some of our presidents... oh yeah, there's that picture I was telling you about. This is an idea I had. A friend of mine did this painting. I just thought it was kind of cool. And this is a doctor. She loves dogs, and she was kind of growling and showing her teeth at the same time that the Chihuahua was. And that's a younger Fidel and his brother. This is one of the artists in Havana. He's pretty well known, Fuster. That's this neighborhood that he's kind of turned into a lot of murals. And that's in the Casa de las Americas. It's a large tree that is several different little pieces of art put together. This is out in the area where they have the tobacco, and it's a mural of prehistoric animals. It's just an artist getting a little creative with some toilets. So if you don't know what to do with an old toilet, you just throw some plants in it. Just don't call it pot, right? So this is some of the dancing in Cuba. They actually kind of line you up with Cuban dance partners when you're doing dancing, which is kind of fun. So you get to meet somebody, and if you don't know how to dance very well, you can just kind of follow them and they'll help you along. Quicker way to learn. Some more dancing on the streets. And this guy actually created this instrument. So it's like a series of metal contraptions that he does like a lot of percussions on. And this is at the Benny Moré Museum in Cienfuegos, famous singer and dancer. And this is one of the community projects we were working on, that they have that mural art program. So everybody kind of made one tile, and then those tiles were all put together and then put up on a board. And this is one of the famous dance troupes that actually came to the United States and performed, but that's them performing in Havana. Just some school children in Havana. This is one of the orphanages where the children stay, kind of like the barracks for the boys. And it's a guy just selling some street food. This is a homemade pizza oven. So you can't, I don't know if you can tell, but it's just, what it is it's a garbage can that they cut in half, and then they put a string of rack to heat things with, and then he's got a little drawer there. So that's his pizza oven. I was telling you about how inventive they are with the different things they have. And he just used charcoal underneath it. That's his pizza oven. And this is in the Tropicana in Havana, where they have Harry's. It's actually a restaurant inside the Tropicana. This is just in the market selling some art. And that's my daughter drinking a mocha that I didn't know was spiked. So she was pretty happy. The bus ride home was very interesting. We have to ask what's in the coffee always. That's what she told me. She goes, Dad, remember now when you go on that tour, if there's any young kids, make sure that they don't get any alcohol in their coffee. Okay, I'll make sure. It was like a liqueur. And she told them to not put it in, but they forgot, I guess. And this is in Las Terrazas. It's a biosphere there where they have some different plants and hotels and everything there. And this is tobacco growing region. There's a guy down there that's, he's the Juan Valdez of Cuba, rolling up the tobacco. And this is just an art studio that we were kind of walking through and seeing. It's where teachers are taught how to teach art. So it's a little bit kind of like a nonprofit, but nothing is really nonprofit because everything is public owned. And that's Las Terrazas. That's kind of a map of everything that's on there in the whole area. And again, it's actually it's a swim hole, but it actually is an opening, and then it's an underground river that goes all the way to the ocean. So you get some funky fish that don't have eyes and that kind of stuff. This is an alligator park.
They can't get to that swimming hole.
Right.
This is not the same place for
I know,
this
but they
one.
don't have access to
They cannot
alligator
go.
ways.
Yeah,
Okay.
you won't be surprised.
Alligator alleyways.
Yeah. I put that slide just for that reason, to get that question.
Yeah, I bet.
This is the same area where they have the alligator caretakers. And this is a garden where they're growing different plants for medicinal purposes. So inside the cathedral in Havana, it was actually a Jesuit cathedral. But the Jesuits, like many places, were thrown out. And that's in Cienfuegos. It's a palace across the street from the hotel. There's a Che Guevara monument in Santa Clara. So Santa Clara is a different province, and they have actually the University of Santa Clara where you can study Che Guevara studies, political science and revolutionary thinking ideas. This was one of the train cars that they used in the revolution. So whatever they had to use, whether it was wheelbarrows or tractors or whatever, this was a train car that they loaded up and used in the revolution. And just a sidecar. You see a lot of these sidecars in Cuba. Old car in Old Havana. This is Hemingway's house, and it's his typewriter on the right-hand side where he did a lot of his writing. So he wrote Old Man in the Sea and Whom the Bell Tolls From while I lived in Cuba. That's it. So just a little idea. Okay.